Hey, everybody. All right, so I'm going to be taking you from that amazing expose on DeFi degeneracy to a deep dive on Regen Network and what we're working on and have been working on for a few years. Who here is familiar with the emerging refi movement? Who here is familiar with carbon credits? Who here knows what Regen Network is? Okay, and who here has heard of the Cosmos ecosystem? Okay, just calibrating my expectations here so I know what to talk about. Cool. So Ecological State Protocols were we first wrote about them back in 2017 and sort of were proposing a way to create tools for communities to generate consensus about ecological state and changes of ecological state and quantify and produce value out of that if they so choose. So I'm going to kind of go on a walkthrough about where this technology is now, what it's being used for. I'm also going to take everybody on a little bit of a walkthrough around Regen Network more broadly, the blockchain application development framework that we've been working on, and then do some specifics on on eco-credits and how communities are creating their own representations of ecological value, whether that's carbon credits or biodiversity credits, et cetera. And hopefully I'll do all of that and still have a little bit of time for questions at the end. All right, so what's Regen Network? So at a really broad level, what we're trying to do is link this amazing process of the social construction of value to ecological health. So at a high level, I guess we have some assumptions. We believe that it's kind of a basic human right for people to socially construct value. Doesn't matter if it's Dogecoin or the US dollar or ancient tribal wampum or cacao. Like, people come together, they generate ways to value each other. We really feel like that process should be grounded firmly in ecological health, right? That is something that we all depend on. And so we sort of are in a similar sort of sphere of how do you quantify and incentivize public goods, but very specifically around ecological health. So we build tools to monitor and quantify, as I said, the ecological state and change of state, and tools to help exchange that, find price discovery, trade that value. Okay, so again, I kind of want to just be emphasizing what we're trying to do is build tools for communities to come together and create consensus about ecological health. I'm going to ground that in some pretty concrete ways. We already do that as a society. That's what carbon credits are. And in that framework, there's a centralized black box bureaucracy with a bunch of professional people who bequeath upon society the stamp of a carbon credit. We here maybe in this room might have a different paradigm or different perspective about where legitimacy is sourced from and what we might trust as far as a statement about reality, right? And broadly speaking, I think we could all agree we're kind of in a bit of a sense-making crisis globally, and a lot of that has to do with lack of faith in institutions. So we really feel strongly that you need to build open source tools with open source science so that people can do this work themselves, whether it's an indigenous community in the Amazon or a group of scientists in Switzerland. The tools are kind of the same. Gather around and decide. I was joking earlier today, like, I kind of don't care if the ecological state protocol is I'm going to walk up and like kick the tree, and if 4 people kick the tree and all hurt their toe, we generate consensus that the tree's there. I mean, joking aside, at a pattern level, that's what we're talking about, right? There's a process whereby we agree that something's true and that it's valuable. Okay. What the fuck is Regen Network? So first and foremost, Regen Network is a community of people who are dedicated to this work that I'm talking about. So there's people all over the world participating. Regen Network is a public proof-of-stake network. There's validators running on every continent except for Antarctica. Maybe we'll get something at McMurdo before too long, I don't know. And then there's the technology. So the technology is sourced from the use case and it's sourced from the community needs, not vice versa. So I'll get into this, but that means that we've been building for several years a bespoke application and community-specific blockchain and consensus structure and specific tools that we feel can meet the need of farmers and scientists and other people, and sort of like ask what do those users need and what can we build for them, not sort of like try to bring existing tools and force users into the sort of square peg into a round hole. So right now, Regen Network is comprised of a single blockchain with really two main features. We have Regen Registry, which is a set of components that allow people to register ecological claims and mint ecological assets, essentially, and coming soon, a lot of curatorial and governance capability so that people know who is saying what about where, using what methodology, who else has confidence in it, who's audited it, and that stuff can all lower the cost of somebody checking in on, is this actually valuable? Do I want to buy it or not? Do I place my faith in it? And then on the other side, marketplace functionality. That's the other feature. So we've been building an order book-based DEX. It's one of the nice things about building in Cosmos is we have enough compute power to run a nice batch matching system, to run an order book system that can then plug straight into AMMs. So who's our community? Regen Network community is made up of project developers, people who are taking risk to try to develop carbon credits mostly at the moment, but biodiversity credits, water quality, marine conservation, blue carbon. I mean, there's a huge variety of different things happening. Land stewards, just people on the ground who are actually stewarding landscapes, are a major part of the constituency of the network. Credit designers. Methodology developers, scientists, monitors, and verifiers. It's important to understand that this is sort of, there's a lot of overlap between different groups here, and in some cases, some people or organizations play several, if not even all of these different roles. But also, some people or organizations only play a single role, right? But this is the community that owns and operates Regen Network as a public blockchain and is building this set of tools together. So just briefly taking a moment to look at what does it look like to build your own credit. This is a nice example of a credit we sort of did from beginning to end and sold to Microsoft back at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. So this was a carbon removal credit based on soil health outcomes for regenerative grazing in New South Wales. So you can sort of see what were the components here. We were monitoring soil health and broader ecosystem health and animal welfare in order to generate a credit. There was specific methodologies, specific auditors, and really a whole articulated protocol that the farmers, the auditors, and Microsoft in this case as counterparties all generated consensus. Hey, this is valuable, and we're going to pay you for this outcome that just took place, right? Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about Regen Ledger. So so R&D Inc., which is the company that I'm the founder of, and Regen Network more broadly, which has a bunch of different organizations in it, tends to sort of have a Cosmos bias in our thinking about blockchain. What that means is the right tools for the community. We really want to see a direct overlap between layer 0, or that is to say in this case mostly humans, but there could be other agents involved in consensus. The community and the tool that you use to generate consensus about parameters that are important to have consensus around. Really think there needs to be a one-to-one overlap in governance there. So we really buy into this concept of sovereign but interoperable blockchains, or that is to say the interchain vision. So it doesn't really matter if you're running an EVM or a WASM-based virtual machine, or maybe you have a concept that doesn't include arbitrary smart contracting frameworks. The sort of Cosmos maximalism is the community that's using the tool needs to govern the tool, and that's sort of one of the reasons why we've been quite compelled and are pretty deep in that ecosystem, which I would say is sort of like a friendly cousin to the Ethereum world. So what is Regen Ledger? Regen Ledger is a public proof of stake blockchain built with the Cosmos SDK. the consensus mechanism here is Tendermint, which is fast finality, allowing us to have sort of the foundation for interoperability and light client-based trustless bridging with other blockchains, which is important. Cosmos SDK, toolkit for creating your own on-chain executable logic. And then Regen Ledger, in this case, is our blockchain with the specific modules and the specific functionality that our community deems as important and secure in order to create these sort of ecological assets and bring them into the marketplace. I sort of talked about this a little bit already. I got a little bit ahead of myself. Our approach here is really to create a public blockchain that is community specific. That is to say, the actors that want to create consensus about ecological health, and application specific, which is really that is a specific process, right? So our blockchain doesn't have an arbitrary smart contracting framework. You can't go launch random stuff on Regen Ledger. You need to go through a community process for the community to say, yeah, that's definitely something that is going to further this goal. And that's sort of a lean, application-specific logic. We have amazing sort of sister chains, Juno and Evmos launching and other things where arbitrary smart contracting is the way it is, and you can do interchain calls and people can have all sorts of fun, but in our worldview, you really want that sort of like governance restraint around what's happening. It all comes back to how are you generating legitimacy, how are you generating consensus about ecological state as the foundation for a new value exchange between people. Okay, so I sort of have said the word module a few times. Essentially, modules are kind of governance permission smart contracts with specific executable functionality. So each module is sort of an audited bit of code that does something really specific. So in our system, we have an Ecocredit module, which is the representation of ecological credits. We have the data module, which allows you to anchor, sign, and resolve data either on or off chain in support of those eco-credits or other functionality. Group module, which is essentially a DAO functionality. And then the standard proof of stake set of modules, as well as an order book DEX coming. Some of these, just to the Ecocredit module and the basket module, which isn't on here, are live right now and in use. Data and groups and order book are coming in Q2. And some of this stuff is up on experimental testnet, some of it not yet. Just a quick detour on and off chain data. So we're really interested in and have essentially focused on the RDF, Resource Description Framework, W3C standard for how we approach on and off chain data. Totally, if you're a data geek, it's really worth looking up and kind of understanding. It's really a fantastic way of expressing things in triples. Which allows you to create a knowledge graph where you can actually make sense of the data in relationship to other claims and then what it's being used for. So it's pretty fantastic. I would definitely recommend looking into that if you're into sort of geospatial data and claims and things. We're sort of gambling that this will become a pretty significant Web3 standard, this sort of approach to semantic data. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the Ecocredit module specifically, because this is really where the state of Ecological State Protocols is, which is the creation of a unit of account that represents some form of ecological value. And in our case at the moment, this is mostly carbon credits, right? That's where the bulk of the market action is. And as I mentioned earlier, there's also a lot of other stuff going on, but those are unproven markets as yet. So the Ecocredit module, essentially this is enabling communities to manage new classes of ecosystem service credits, right? So you could think of each credit class has an administrator. That administrator can either be a single entity or a DAO, right? So you can build community around a specific credit class. So what do we mean by that? Right now we're in a process with the Carbon Plus Grasslands credit, which was that initial pilot that we sold all of these credits to Microsoft. It was a really big deal when it happened. There's a community forming around that to govern that. It includes ranchers and scientists. that are sort of like owning that and developing it into the future, right? So biodiversity credits, et cetera. It allows us to create the right sort of social consensus system around this new unit of account that's being created, right? Issuers can also be considered DAOs, so you have this sort of like nested DAO framework. One community is setting the criteria, the minting criteria essentially, right? The issuance criteria, and then the issuer is following that criteria, right? And making sure that it's being executed and then issuing those credits. Okay, so I keep using the term credit class, right? What is that? What does that mean? You know, sort of abstractly, this is the representation of how we think about the new unit of account. You know, is this a ton year? Is it a ton 100 years? Is it a avoided emissions credit, conservation credit, biodiversity? You have to define that specifically and define how you're measuring it, who has the ability to sign off on it. You know, all of those things need to be defined in the credit class. And here's sort of like the actual on-chain, this is what it looks like. There's class ID, who's the administrator, who are the issuers who are allowed to issue these credits, what's the credit type, what's the unit of account that we're talking about, any associated metadata that must be included, and then the number of batches. So you sort of have kind of micro governance control over each credit class. Credit types is very important. So this is an example of carbon. Carbon, what's its abbreviation, what's the measurement unit, what sort of decimal precision do you have? These are sort of just basic bits of logic that if you're going to be generating a credit on Regen Ledger, this is how it comes out on the ledger itself. Batches. So each credit you could think of in Ethereum world, you might think of these as fractional NFTs, right? In terms of how things show up. So they're fungible amongst themselves within a batch, because you have a unit and then you have a number of units that have been issued. Maybe that's a ton from a particular farm in a particular year. Those are fungible amongst each other, but they're not fungible with credits of either different denom or even the same credit class, but on a different farm necessarily, unless you choose. And that's sort of a cool, we think, a cool functionality to drive price discovery around specific rigor or other qualities. Maybe when we get into Q&A, we can talk about liquidity and other sort of market mechanisms. So I'm just going to take a second to look at this, see if there's anything important to bring your attention to. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Well, I'll just say, this has really been thoughtfully designed to try to create circumstances where credits are on-chain and machine auditable, right? So we're trying to express all of the important data about the agreement, about ecological state, which has been generated by a group of people, right? So that can be quickly and cheaply audited. So part of the theory of change here is to lower the cost of auditing. Right now, if you go to try to audit a carbon credit, it's cost prohibitive. You essentially need to hire a white collar professional, sort of like PhD level person to spend 3 months to like go through PDFs and interview people and all of these. It's like quite expensive to actually like legitimately audit a project. Whereas if you have all of this stuff made explicit on chain and including who has actually audited it before you and who has generated consensus that this is indeed a methodology that's worth following, you can lower the cost of auditing, and we think even make it like one-click audit. Like you could actually run an audit before you make a purchase of an asset. Okay, so what's a life cycle of a credit look like? You have the admin that creates the credit class. You have issuers that issue those credits. In the case of carbon credits, these are a commodity. They need to be retired. There's a life cycle of a credit. It has utility to retire to offset an emission that happened somewhere else. That's the specific purpose of that type of eco-credit. There's probably a lot of design room and people are, as I've mentioned, designing other credit types that aren't necessarily sort of this sort of retirement focus, but that's the life cycle of a carbon credit. So each one of these has on-chain executable logic. You can create the batch, you can send, retire, and cancel the batch. That's what credits do as an on-chain entity. So at the moment, we're still working with command line interface for all the Ecocredit modules. There's a UI coming soon, which is going to be really exciting and help us accelerate the types of users that we can bring into the ecosystem to interact with all of this. There's a REST API available for third-party developers. And we have a pretty robust community and Discord, so if people are interested, there's a lot of support and and a pretty big community of people leaning in to think about this. So there you can see the available commands. You can cancel. One of the interesting things is you can cancel a credit batch, which we thought was quite important in the case of credits moving between registries that don't yet have API calls between them, to avoid double counting. So you can cancel it off of our registry without it being considered retired, right? So that's a nice functionality there. All right, so how do you build your own credit? And I just need to check on time here, see where I'm at. This is a nice little visual that was put together by some of our community members, the Era Brazil and EcoNavi folks. They're building a credit class dedicated to jaguar rainforest preservation and conservation. So it's a biodiversity credit. And they were trying to create a little visual that would help them articulate this to their stakeholders. I thought this was pretty nice. So credit type is sort of the trunk. Credit classes are different ways, like carbon credits are all going to have similar credit types, and then credit classes are going to be specific, like our grazing credit or an agroforestry credit or a blue carbon credit class. Each one of these is going to have sort of a specific set of agreed upon methodologies to generate that consensus about ecological state, which we'll continue to come back to. And then the batches of credits, of course, are how these are issued. So one of the things we've really been shooting for is this concept of nested and composable governance around the places where people need to be generating consensus and have a social process to say, we agree that this is valuable and here's why. And so, again, this is we work with scientists. So our community, I guess people may have varying degrees of exposure of what Regen Network does and how long we've been around, but we work with the USDA and major research institutions, and there's this whole really interesting crypto pilling science and farmers and stuff that's taking place, right? So we've run quadratic funding experiments with large institutions where they're how do we allocate our funding for open source science and software? So when we're talking about governance, we're talking about both institutional governance over credit classes and the approach to monitoring and verifying an outcome like carbon sequestration into soil or something. And the stakeholders who are going to participate in that are scientists and companies and universities, right? So methodologies are coming on chain as entities with governance themselves, which is really exciting. Peer review processes on chain. So one of the things you could sort of think about that taking place here is kind of a formalization of peer review and scientific method in a community process directed towards, again, this sort of fundamental question of what is the current health of our ecosystems and what's the health outcome that we would like to be incentivizing together, and we would like to be issuing assets in order to generate new forms of liquidity and resource allocation for these outcomes that we all want. So again, native Web3 carbon and ecological asset registry. So it's very radically different from existing registry programs where, again, you sort of have this centralized bureaucracy. And I think everybody has great intentions, so I don't want to sort of talk too much smack about that approach, but it's really expensive, it's really slow, and it's really opaque. And so the hope here is to make this much more dynamic, much more community-oriented, and much more transparent, and really accelerate it, because that's what we need right now in terms of, we're in an ecological crisis. So thank you. I feel like I'm sort of saying the same things over and over again here, which is probably good. this is really based on an idea of show your work, don't trust, verify, right? What is the work that's underpinning a claim? Can you express that clearly so that other people can see it and then choose whether or not they agree? So here's an example of credit batch metadata that shows up in the command line interface. And here's a couple examples of different eco-credits that are being developed right now. So we're working with Toucan, for instance, to bring existing registry systems on chain, which is exciting. That functionality is pretty much all already built. So we're going to be launching the NCT carbon standard into the Cosmos ecosystem here very shortly, which is really exciting. There's also our own natively community-produced Carbon Plus crediting system, which has credits that are going to be coming on chain. There's organic farming and aquaculture systems, all sorts of really amazing stuff happening. So things that are coming in Q2, decentralized credit exchange, interface for people issuing and purchasing credits. A lot of this is CLI at the moment, unfortunately. And then coming up actually in about a week, I think we have a governance proposal up right now about the basket function, where you can basically say, hey, any credit that meets the following criteria can be pooled, turned into a fungible token. They all represent each other, and then turned into an IBC compatible token, which is the inter-blockchain communication standard, which allows us to send those tokens to places like Osmosis and get people engaged in yield farming and liquidity mining and building liquidity, and really turning this into a green money Lego, which I think is one of the bigger use cases. So I'm going to end by just saying, where are we at right now? We have about 40 methodology and credit class developers actively developing at this moment, representing more than 12 million hectares of ecological regeneration, which is really rad. Kind of a dream. We couldn't have envisioned that we'd be this far, this fast. And credit types spanning blue carbon, ocean conservation, soil carbon, agroforestry, biodiversity. It's really fantastic. So if people want to learn more, go to regen.network/resources, and all of these docs are there, and you can sort of dig in and get a deeper dive. So I'm going to end. There may be time for one question, I'm not sure. It looks like got 2 minutes left.
Unfortunately, we're really close on time, but thank you for the presentation. Let's give it up. In the meantime, we're going to flip the stage for